Good evening all and welcome back to Mr. Chill Chapter. Tonight we're diving into 10 deeply personal accounts from real people who encountered something unexplainable in the mysterious Appalachian Mountains. These aren't fictional tales or urban legends. These are raw, unfiltered testimonies from individuals whose lives were forever changed by what they witnessed in those ancient hills. Each person reached out to share their story because they need others to know that something truly haunting dwells in America's oldest mountain range. If you're new here, make sure to subscribe to Mr. Chill Chapter. For authentic horror stories that will chill you to the bone, hit that notification bell so you never miss when real terror calls your name. Now let's listen to 10 souls brave enough to share their most haunting Appalachian experiences, where the mountains themselves seem to watch, and some encounters leave scars that never heal. What I'm about to tell you happened just 6 months ago, and I still can't sleep through the night. I feel like I'm being watched constantly, even in my own home. I don't know if what I encountered in those mountains was human or something else entirely, but I know I'll never go back. My name is Sarah, and I need to share this because maybe someone else has experienced what I did. Maybe someone can explain what's still hunting me. I've been hiking the Appalachian trails for over 15 years. I'm not some weekend warrior who gets lost looking for Instagram photos. I know these mountains like the back of my hand, or at least I thought I did. I'm a certified wilderness guide. I carry proper gear, and I've spent countless nights alone in the backcountry without so much as a moment of unease. The mountains have always been my sanctuary, my escape from the chaos of everyday life. I'm most comfortable when it's just me, my pack, and the endless ridgeline stretching toward the horizon. This particular trip was supposed to be a 3-day solo camping excursion in a remote section of the Blue Ridge Mountains in Virginia. I'd chosen a trail that sees maybe a dozen hikers per month, the kind of place where you can hike for days without seeing another soul. It was early October, perfect hiking weather with the leaves just starting to turn and that crisp mountain air that makes you feel alive. I'd done this exact route twice before, so I knew every water source, every good camping spot, every tricky section of trail. I started my hike on a Friday morning, parking at the small gravel lot that marks the trailhead. The Forest Service road leading to it is barely maintained, and you need 4-wheel drive just to reach it safely. As I shouldered my pack and locked my Jeep, I felt that familiar sense of excitement and peace. This was my element. This was where I belonged. The first day was absolutely perfect. I made good time on the trail, enjoyed the solitude, and set up camp at my planned spot, a small clearing beside a mountain stream about 8 miles in. I pitched my tent, filtered water, cooked dinner, and settled in for what I expected to be a peaceful evening. The only sounds were the babbling creek, the rustle of leaves in the gentle breeze, and the occasional hoot of an owl. But as I sat by my small campfire that first night, something felt off. I couldn't put my finger on it initially. The forest seemed quieter than usual. No small animals scurrying through the underbrush. No night birds calling to each other, just an unusual stillness that made me more aware of every sound I was making. When I shifted position, the crinkle of my jacket seemed unnaturally loud. When I stirred the fire, the pop of burning wood echoed strangely through the trees. I chalked it up to my imagination and went to bed around 10 Alcids. But throughout that first night, I kept waking up. Not from nightmares or discomfort, just this nagging feeling that something was watching me. You know that sensation when someone's staring at you from across a room? It was like that, but amplified. I'd lie perfectly still in my sleeping bag, listening intently, but heard nothing out of the ordinary. Saturday morning brought beautiful weather, and I convinced myself that my unease had been nothing more than first-night jitters. Even experienced hikers sometimes get spooked by the profound silence of the deep woods. I broke camp early and continued deeper into the mountains. following a trail that would take me to my next planned campsite about 10 mi further in. That's when things started going wrong. Around noon, as I was taking a water break on a rocky outcrop with a view of the valley below, I caught movement in my peripheral vision, just a flash of something dark between the trees about 100 yards away. When I turned to look directly, there was nothing there. I studied the spot for several minutes, thinking maybe I'd seen a deer or a bear, but the forest was perfectly still. An hour later, it happened again. This time I was certain I saw a figure, tall, wearing dark clothing, moving parallel to the trail about 50 yards to my left. But when I stopped and called out, "Hello, is someone there?" my voice echoed back unanswered. The silence that followed felt oppressive, like the entire forest was holding its breath. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe another hiker was taking an alternate route. Maybe I was seeing shadows cast by moving clouds. But my instincts, the same instincts that had kept me safe in the wilderness for years, were screaming that something was wrong. By late afternoon, I reached my planned campsite for the second night. It was another small clearing, this one surrounded by towering hemlocks that created natural walls on 3 sides. I'd camped here before and always felt secure, but now the enclosing trees felt more like a trap than protection. As I set up my tent, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. In the soft earth near the fire ring, there were footprints. Fresh ones. Boot prints that were definitely not mine. Larger with a different tread pattern. Someone had been in this clearing recently. Very recently, I tried to tell myself it was just another hiker who had used the site before moving on, but the prints circled my tent area multiple times as if someone had been walking around and around, studying the space. There were no prints leading away from the clearing on any of the obvious trails. That second night was when my world truly shifted into nightmare territory. I didn't build a fire. Something told me I needed to stay hidden, to not announce my presence any more than necessary. I ate a cold dinner in my tent as darkness fell, every sense heightened, every shadow suspect. The silence was complete now. No insects, no night birds, nothing. It was as if the entire forest ecosystem had fled from something. Around midnight, I heard it for the first time. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps circling my camp. They moved with purpose, but no urgency, as if whoever was out there knew I wasn't going anywhere. The steps would pause for long minutes, then resume, always maintaining that same measured distance from my tent. I lay frozen in my sleeping bag, barely breathing, clutching my knife. The footsteps continued for what felt like hours. Sometimes they seemed to come from multiple directions, as if there was more than one person out there, but I never heard voices. Never heard the normal sounds people make when moving through the forest at night. When dawn finally broke, I unzipped my tent with shaking hands. The footprints from the night before were gone, but new ones had taken their place. These circled even closer to my tent, and some were pressed so deep into the earth it was as if something incredibly heavy had made them. I packed my gear in record time and started hiking out. I'd planned to spend one more night, but every fiber of my being was telling me to get out of those mountains immediately. The trail back to my car was 12 mies, and I intended to cover it as fast as possible. But the forest had other plans. About 4 mi into my hike out, I realized I was lost. The trail I'd followed dozens of times before seemed to have changed overnight. Markers I remembered were gone. The path forked where it had never forked before. My GPS unit showed my location as somewhere impossible. According to the device, I was standing in the middle of a lake that didn't exist. Panic began to set in as I realized I was being hurted. Every wrong turn I took led me deeper into unmarked wilderness. Every time I tried to backtrack, the trail behind me looked different than when I'd hiked it just minutes before. And then I saw my stalker. It was standing on a ridge about 200 YD away, perfectly still watching me. From that distance, I couldn't make out details, but it was definitely human-shaped, tall, wearing dark clothing that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. When I raised my hand to wave, it didn't respond. When I shouted, it didn't move. It just stood there watching. I ran. I crashed through the underbrush, abandoning the trail entirely, heading in what I hoped was the direction of my car. Branches tore at my clothes and pack. I fell multiple times, scraping my hands and knees on rocks and roots. Behind me, I could hear something following. Not running, just maintaining that same steady pace. Like it knew it didn't need to hurry. Hours later, exhausted and disoriented, I stumbled onto a gravel road I didn't recognize, but it was a road which meant civilization. I followed it until I found a house where the residents called the sheriff for me. When the deputy arrived, I was barely coherent, babbling about being followed and stalked in the woods. The search and rescue team found my Jeep 2 days later. My 3-day supply of food was gone, along with several pieces of gear that had been securely packed in my tent. The deputy said it looked like someone had been camping in my gear for weeks, but that was impossible. I'd only been in the woods for 2 days. To this day, I can't explain what happened in those mountains. I can't explain how I got lost on a trail I knew by heart, or how my gear ended up scattered across a campsite I'd never seen before. I can't explain the footprints that appeared and disappeared or the figure that watched me from the ridgeline, but I know one thing with absolute certainty. Something in those ancient mountains wanted me to stay. Something that doesn't show up on maps or leave normal tracks. Something that's still calling my name on quiet nights, whispering from shadows that shouldn't exist. I've moved twice since then, but the watching never stops. And sometimes, when I'm alone in my apartment at night, I can swear I smell hemlock and mountain air seeping under my door. This happened 3 years ago, but I still wake up in cold sweats. My family thinks I'm losing my mind, but I know what I saw in that hollow. There are things in the Appalachian that should have stayed buried, and I accidentally disturbed one of them. My name is Marcus, and I used to be passionate about genealogy research. Used to be. Some family histories are meant to stay lost. I'd spent 5 years tracing my mother's side of the family tree, following paper trails and cemetery records back through generations of Appalachian settlers. It's painstaking work, but I loved the detective aspect of it, piecing together lives from fragments of documents, birth certificates, and faded photographs. My great-great-grandmother, Abigail Thornton, had always been a mystery. She'd appeared in census records in 1890, married to my great-great-grandfather in a remote hollow in eastern Kentucky. There was no record of her before that, no birth certificate, no family connections, nothing. It was like she'd materialized from thin air. After months of dead ends, I finally found a breakthrough. A distant cousin reached out through a genealogy form, claiming he knew where Abigail's original homestead still stood. Deep in the Daniel Boone National Forest, in a hollow so remote it didn't appear on modern maps. He said his grandfather had been the area's unofficial historian for decades and had kept detailed records of all the old families and their properties. His name was Ezra Caldwell, and when we spoke on the phone, his voice carried that distinctive mountain accent that spoke of generations rooted in those hills. He offered to guide me to the homestead, warning that it was a difficult hike and that the Forest Service road leading to the trailhead was barely passable. But he seemed genuinely excited to help someone research the area's history, and his knowledge of the region appeared encyclopedic. We arranged to meet on a Saturday morning in October at a gas station in the small town of Whitesburg. I drove down from Ohio with my camera gear, laptop, and portable scanner, expecting to spend the day documenting whatever remained of Abigail's home and maybe finding some family artifacts that could fill in the gaps in her story. Ezra was exactly what I'd expected. a wiry man in his 70s with weathered hands and sharp blue eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. He wore faded jeans, work boots, and a flannel shirt that had seen better decades. His pickup truck looked like it had been navigating mountain roads since the Carter administration, but he assured me it was the only vehicle that could handle where we were going. The drive to the trailhead took nearly an hour on increasingly narrow and deteriorating roads. Ezra filled the time with stories about the old families who'd settled these hollows in the 1800s, their feuds and tragedies, and how most of the homesteads had been abandoned when coal mining moved into the area in the earlier 1900s. He spoke about Abigail's family with particular knowledge, mentioning details about their property and lifestyle that weren't in any records I'd found. The Thornton kept to themselves, he said, as we bounced over a particularly brutal section of road. Even by mountain standards, they were private folks. Abigail's father, Silas, he had a reputation for dealing with things that other folks wouldn't touch. Problems that the church couldn't solve, if you catch my meaning. When I pressed him for details, he just shook his head and said some stories were better left alone. We parked at what barely qualified as a trailhead, just a widening in the road where the forest pressed in from all sides. Ezra shouldered a worn canvas pack and led me down what might have once been a logging road, but was now little more than a deer path. The October air was crisp and sweet with the smell of dying leaves, and for the first mile or so I felt that familiar excitement of historical discovery. But as we descended deeper into the hollow, something began to feel wrong. The forest was too quiet. No bird songs, no rustling of small animals in the underbrush. Even our footsteps seemed muffled by an oppressive stillness that made me want to whisper. "How much further?" I asked after we'd been hiking for nearly 2 hours. Ezra checked his watch and frowned. "Should have been there by now. These old paths, they shift sometimes. Don't worry, I'll find it." Another hour of hiking brought us to a clearing that took my breath away, but not for the reasons I'd expected. Standing in the center of the hollow was a 2-story log cabin that looked like it had been built yesterday. The chinking between the logs was fresh. The roof showed no signs of weather damage, and glass windows reflected the afternoon sunlight without a crack or chip visible. "This can't be right," I said, approaching cautiously. "This house is supposed to be over a century old." Ezra had gone very quiet behind me, and when I turned to look at him, his face had gone pale. This ain't how it was last time I was here," he muttered. I walked up to the front porch, which creaked under my weight but felt solid and new. The door was unlocked. Inside, dust motes danced in shafts of sunlight streaming through clean windows. But the dust itself was wrong. Instead of the thick, undisturbed layers you'd expect in an abandoned house, it was just a light coating, as if someone had been living here recently, but had stepped out for a few days. The furniture was period appropriate, but in impossibly good condition. A rough hew-kneed table sat in the center of the main room with tin plates and cups arranged as if for a family meal. Clothes hung on wooden pegs near the door. Women's dresses and faded but intact fabric. Men's work shirts that still smelled faintly of wood smoke and sweat. "Ezra," I called, but got no response. When I went back outside, he was standing at the tree-line, staring at the house with an expression I couldn't read. "We need to document everything," I said, pulling out my camera. "This is incredible. It's like a perfectly preserved time capsule." But when I tried to turn on my camera, nothing happened. The battery showed full charge, but the device was completely dead. My phone was the same, full signal according to the bars. But when I tried to take a photo, the screen went black. That's when I noticed the footprints. In the soft earth around the cabin's foundation, there were fresh boot prints, recent ones. Someone with small feet, probably a woman, had been walking around the house. The prints led to various windows, as if someone had been looking inside, but they didn't lead away from the house on any visible path. Ezra, are you seeing this? But when I turned around, he was gone. I called his name repeatedly, my voice echoing strangely off the surrounding hills. There was no response, no sound of movement in the forest. It was as if he'd simply vanished. Fighting down panic, I decided to continue documenting the site. If my electronics weren't working, I'd take notes by hand and try to find some family artifacts that might explain the house's impossible condition. Inside, I discovered a narrow staircase leading to the second floor. The steps were solid under my feet, showing no signs of age or wear. Upstairs, I found 2 bedrooms, both furnished with simple wooden beds and quilts that looked freshly made. In what appeared to be the master bedroom, I found them. Family photographs arranged on a small dresser, but something was terribly wrong with them. Every single photograph had the faces scratched out with what looked like fingernails. Deep gouges in the glass revealed images of people in period clothing, but their faces were obliterated by frenzied scratching. My hands were shaking as I picked up one photograph. A family portrait showing a man, woman, and 3 children posed in front of this very house. Based on their clothing, it was from the 1890s. The woman's face was completely destroyed, but I could make out enough of the man to see a resemblance to my own features. That's when I heard the voices downstairs. Muffled conversation was drifting up from the main room. A man's voice and a woman's discussing something in urgent whispers. I crept to the top of the stairs and listened, but I couldn't make out the words. The voices sounded like they were coming from underwater, distorted and strange. "Hello?" I called down. "Is someone there?" The conversation stopped abruptly, replaced by a silence so complete it felt like a weight pressing down on me. I descended the stairs slowly, each step seeming to echo forever in the suddenly cavernous house. The main room was empty, but now there were fresh, muddy footprints on the wooden floor. Prints that hadn't been there minutes before. That's when I noticed the basement door, set into the floor near the back. Wall was a heavy wooden trapdoor I swear hadn't been there when I'd first entered the house. It was standing open, revealing wooden steps disappearing into darkness below. Against every instinct screaming at me to run, I found myself walking toward that opening. The voices were coming from down there now, clearer, more distinct. A man arguing with a woman about something that had to be stopped before it got out. I descended the steps using my dead phone's flashlight function, which somehow worked now. The basement was larger than the house's footprint should have allowed, stretching back into shadows. My light couldn't penetrate. The walls were rough stone and the air smelled of earth and something else, something sweet and rotting. Along the far wall were shelves lined with glass jars containing things I didn't want to examine too closely. In the center of the room was a wooden table carved with symbols I didn't recognize, stained with what looked like rust but probably wasn't. And scattered across the table were dozens of journals, all written in the same feminine handwriting. I opened the top journal with trembling hands. The first entry was dated just 3 days ago. "He's coming back. I can feel him getting closer. The family line is almost complete, and then I'll be free to rest. Marcus is the last one. When he arrives, it will all be finished." My own name written in faded ink in a journal that looked a century old. I flipped through page after page of entries spanning decades, all referring to family members who had come home to the Hollow. Entries about my grandfather's visit in 1962 when he chose to stay. About my great-uncle's arrival in 1983 when he understood his purpose. The final entry dated yesterday. Ezra brought him just like the others. The door is open, the family can be whole again. That's when the basement door slammed shut above me. I raced up the stairs, pushing against the trap door with all my strength, but it wouldn't budge. Something heavy had been placed on top of it. Something far heavier than furniture. From above, I could hear footsteps moving around the house. Multiple sets of footsteps, some light, some heavy, all circling the basement door. And voices, my family's voices, my grandfather calling my name, though he died when I was 12. My great-uncle laughing, a sound I remembered from childhood visits. And a woman's voice, patient and kind. "Come upstairs, Marcus, it's time to come home. It's time to join the family." I used my keys to chip away at the mortar around the basement's back wall, working frantically as the voices above grew more insistent. After what felt like hours, I managed to create an opening large enough to crawl through. I emerged into the forest behind the house just as full darkness was falling. The cabin now looked the way it should have, abandoned with broken windows and a sagging roof. But lights flickered in those broken windows, and shadows moved back and forth across the gaps. I ran through the forest, crashing through underbrush in what I hoped was the direction of Ezra's truck. Branches tore at my clothes and face, but I didn't stop until I reached the road. The truck was there, but Ezra wasn't. The keys were in the ignition, as if he'd left them there deliberately. I drove that ancient pickup down the mountain road faster than was safe, not stopping until I reached the gas station where we'd met. When I called the sheriff to report Ezra missing, they told me something that made my blood freeze. Ezra Caldwell had been reported missing in 1987. His truck had been found at the bottom of a ravine, but his body was never recovered. I'd spent the day with a man who'd been dead for over 30 years. I never finished researching my family tree. I burned all the genealogy materials I'd collected and moved across the country. But sometimes on quiet nights I can still hear that woman's voice calling my name, patient and persistent, reminding me that I have family waiting in that hollow. Some secrets are buried for good reason. And the dead don't always rest peacefully in the Appalachian Mountains. They wait for the bloodline to come home. I'm sharing this story because I need people to understand. If you ever hear the mountains calling your name, don't listen. Don't follow the voices. I almost didn't make it back. And part of me is still up there waiting. My name is David, and I used to be a mountain climber. Used to be. Because after what happened on Grandfather Mountain last spring, I can't look at peaks without hearing my name whispered on the wind. I've been climbing for 23 years since I was 16 years old. Started on the local rock faces in North Carolina, then moved on to technical climbs throughout the Appalachian and beyond. I've summited peaks in Colorado, Montana, even attempted Denali twice. But the Appalachian Mountains have always been my first love. Those ancient, worn-down peaks that hide secrets in their shadows and call to something deep in my soul. There's a spiritual connection I've always felt with these mountains. My Cherokee grandmother used to tell me stories about the spirits that lived in the high places, how they would sometimes choose certain people to join them in the eternal dance between earth and sky. I never took those stories literally, but I understood the feeling she was describing. When I'm climbing, when I'm pushing myself against stone and gravity and my own limitations, I feel connected to something larger than myself. The climb that changed everything was supposed to be routine. Grandfather Mountain in North Carolina isn't technically challenging. It's more of a strenuous hike than a true climb. But there's an area on the north face that most tourists never see. A section of exposed rock and narrow ledges that requires technical skills to navigate safely. I'd done this route probably 50 times over the years, usually when I needed to clear my head or reconnect with why I started climbing in the first place. I set out alone on a Thursday morning in early May. The weather forecast was perfect. Clear skies, mild temperatures, light winds. I planned to take the tourist trail to the top, then rappel down the technical route on the north face. Something I'd done many times before. It's a beautiful descent, offering views of the valley that few people ever experience. The hike to the summit was unremarkable. I passed a few other hikers on the main trail, exchanged pleasantries, and reached the top around noon. The observation deck was busy with families and amateur photographers, so I found a quiet spot away from the crowds to eat lunch and prepare my gear for the descent. That's when I first heard it. David, my name, called out clear as day, coming from somewhere beyond the tourist areas. Not shouted, but spoken at a normal conversational volume. Yet somehow I could hear it perfectly over the wind and the chatter of other visitors. I looked around, thinking maybe someone I knew had spotted me, but I didn't recognize anyone. The voice seemed to come from the north face, from the direction I was planning to descend. "David, come here." There it was again, a woman's voice, gentle and familiar, though I couldn't place it. It reminded me of my grandmother's voice, but she'd been dead for 15 years. I approached the edge of the north face and looked down. The technical route I'd planned to take was clearly visible. A series of ledges and rappel points I'd used dozens of times, but now there seemed to be an additional path, a narrow trail following a ridgeline that I'd never noticed before. It looked challenging but manageable, and it seemed to lead to an area of the mountain I'd never explored. The voice came again, more insistent. "This way, David, I've been waiting against my better judgment. And this is something I've regretted every day since." I began following the voice instead of my planned route. I rigged my rappel gear and started down the north face, but instead of following my usual path, I followed the new ridgeline. The rock was solid under my feet and the route seemed well traveled, though I couldn't remember seeing it on any topographical maps. With each step, the voice became clearer, more distinct. "That's right. Keep coming. You're almost here." The rational part of my mind was screaming warnings. This wasn't my planned route. I was deviating from a climb I knew by heart to follow a voice that shouldn't exist. But there was something compelling about the sound, something that made it impossible to turn back. It felt like coming home. The new path led me along a narrow ridge I'd never seen before, offering views of the valley that were completely different from anything I'd experienced on this mountain. The landscape below looked wilder, more primitive, as if I was seeing the area as it had existed centuries ago. No roads, no buildings, just endless forest stretching to the horizon. "David, look at me." I looked up and saw her. Standing on a rocky outcrop about 100 yards ahead was an elderly Native American woman wearing traditional dress. Her long gray hair moved in a wind that I couldn't feel, and her eyes seemed to hold depths that went back generations. She looked exactly like my grandmother had in the old photographs, but somehow ageless. "Grandmother," I called out, though I knew it was impossible. She smiled and beckoned for me to continue climbing toward her. "You've kept me waiting so long, grandson, it's time to come home." Every instinct I'd developed in over 2 decades of climbing was telling me to stop, to turn back, to get off this mountain immediately. But her voice was so warm, so welcoming, and I felt drawn forward by something stronger than logic or survival instinct. As I climbed toward her, strange things began happening to my equipment. My GPS unit started showing impossible coordinates. According to the device, I was climbing a peak that was 3,000 FT higher than Grandfather Mountain's actual elevation. My compass spun wildly, unable to find magnetic north. The air itself seemed to thicken, making each breath an effort, but I kept climbing. The woman, my grandmother, though I knew she couldn't be, continued to encourage me forward. "Just a little further, David. You're almost there, you're almost home." The rocky outcrop where she stood seemed to recede as I approached, always staying just out of reach. Hours passed, though my watch had stopped working. The sun didn't move across the sky. Time itself seemed suspended. That's when I realized I was no longer on Grandfather Mountain. The peak I was climbing stretched impossibly high above me, disappearing into clouds that hadn't been there when I started. The forest below looked different, older, wilder, filled with trees that belonged to an age before human settlement. and scattered across the mountainside were other climbers, dozens of them, all making their way slowly upward with the same determined, dreamy expression I could feel on my own face. "Welcome to the real mountain," my grandmother said. And now her voice was coming from inside my head, the one that exists between the world of the living and the realm of the ancestors. "You've been called home, David. Your climbing was always preparation for this final ascent." I looked more closely at the other climbers and realized with growing horror that they were all wearing outdated gear, equipment from the 1980s, the 1970s, even earlier. Some wore climbing gear I'd only seen in historical photographs. They moved with mechanical precision, never resting, never looking back, their faces serene and empty. "How long have they been climbing?" I asked. "Time has no meaning here," she replied. They climbed the eternal mountain, searching for a summit that can only be reached by those who truly understand what it means to be one with the stone and sky. The rational part of my mind finally broke through the spell. This wasn't my grandmother. This wasn't real. I was experiencing some kind of hallucination, possibly altitude sickness or dehydration, and I was in serious danger. I fumbled for my emergency beacon, the satellite device I always carried on solo climbs. My fingers were clumsy, as if the thin air was affecting my coordination, but I managed to activate the distress signal. The moment I pressed the button, everything changed. The woman who looked like my grandmother let out a shriek of rage that seemed to come from the mountain itself. "You can't leave. You've been chosen. The mountain has called you." The other climbers turned to look at me, their faces no longer serene but hungry and desperate. They began moving faster, scrambling over the rocks toward my position with inhuman speed. I rappelled down the face as fast as I dared, abandoning proper technique in my desperation to escape. The beacon's GPS coordinates were being transmitted to search and rescue, but according to its display, I was somehow 15 miles from where I'd started the climb. Behind me, I could hear the woman's voice, no longer gentle, no longer familiar, screaming my name. "David, you belong to the mountain now. You can't escape." The other climbers were following me down, moving impossibly fast across terrain that should have required careful navigation. But as I descended, they seemed to become less solid, more like shadows cast by moving clouds. I rappelled for what felt like hours, following instinct rather than any planned route, until finally my feet touched solid ground. I was at the base of Grandfather Mountain, but in an area I'd never seen before. My car was nowhere in sight, and the tourist facilities were gone. The emergency beacon signal had reached a search and rescue team, and I could hear helicopter rotors in the distance. When they found me 3 hours later, I was sitting beside a road that didn't match their maps 12 mi from where I'd parked my car. The rescue team said they'd lost my beacon signal multiple times during the search, as if I'd been moving between locations faster than it should have been possible. When they asked me to describe my route, I couldn't. The ridgeline I'd followed, the impossibly high peak, the other climbers, none of it existed on any map or aerial photograph. They found my car in the parking lot where I'd left it with all my backup gear still inside. According to the timestamp on my emergency beacon activation, I'd been missing for 7 hours. But I had no memory of how I'd gotten from the summit to the location where they found me. The doctors at the hospital ran every test they could think of. Blood work for toxins, brain scans for signs of stroke or seizure, psychological evaluations for signs of break from reality. Everything came back normal. Physically, I was fine. Mentally, according to their tests, I was stable and lucid. But I know what I experienced on that mountain, and I know it wasn't a hallucination. I stopped climbing after that day, sold all my gear, canceled planned expeditions, refused invitations to join climbing groups. My friends think I'm going through some kind of midlife crisis. But the truth is simpler and more terrifying. I can still hear the mountain calling my name. Not just Grandfather Mountain, but all of them. every peak I see on the horizon, every summit visible from my apartment window. They whisper my name on quiet nights, promising that the eternal climb is still waiting, that my place among the shadow climbers is still reserved. I've moved to the city, but I know it's only a matter of time. The Appalachian Mountains never really let you go. And someday I'll hear that voice again, warm, familiar, irresistible, calling me home to a summit that exists beyond maps in time, where climbers ascend forever in search of something that can never be reached. The mountains are patient. They know I'll return, and part of me, the part that felt most alive when I was pushing myself against stone and sky, is already there waiting. I'm telling this story because I need someone to believe me. 3 months ago, I drove down a road that shouldn't exist, and I'm not sure I ever really made it back. Every GPS in town shows the same thing now. A road where there used to be forest, but I know the truth about what's really down there. My name is Jake Morrison, and I've been driving these mountain roads for 20 years. After what happened on Route 19 in West Virginia, I don't know if I'll ever drive alone again. I've been a long-haul trucker since I was 22 years old, following in my father's footsteps and his father's before him. The Morrison family has been moving freight through the Appalachian Mountains for 3 generations. And we know these roads better than most people know their own neighborhoods. Every curve, every grade, every truck stop from Virginia to Alabama, it's all mapped out in my head like a personal GPS system. I take pride in that knowledge. While other drivers rely on their satellite navigation and electronic route planners, I can tell you the best way to get from point A to point B without ever looking at a screen. I know which roads can handle a fully loaded rig, which ones have low bridges, and which ones turn into muddy nightmares when it rains. It's not just a job for me. It's a craft passed down through generations of mountain truckers. The night everything changed, I was hauling a load of furniture from a factory in North Carolina to a warehouse in Columbus, Ohio. It was a routine run I'd made probably 50 times over the years, usually taking Interstate 77 north through West Virginia before connecting to other highways. The load wasn't particularly heavy, and I was making good time despite leaving 3 hours behind schedule due to a delay at the factory. It was just past midnight when I entered West Virginia, and I was looking at a long night ahead of me. I'd planned to push through to a truck stop outside Charleston, grab a few hours of sleep, then finish the run to Columbus in the morning. The roads were empty except for the occasional passing car, and I had my CB radio tuned to channel 19, listening to the scattered chatter of other night drivers. That's when my GPS unit, a top-of-the-line system I'd splurged on the year before, suggested something I'd never seen in 2 decades of driving these mountains. Into MEI, turn right for alternate route, the mechanical voice announced. This route will save you 37 minutes and 42 miles. I glanced at the screen, frowning. The suggested route showed a road cutting directly through an area I knew to be impassable mountain terrain. According to the display, this mystery road would bypass Charleston entirely and connect directly to my planned route near the Ohio border. That's impossible, I muttered, but I was curious. In 20 years of driving, I'd never seen this road on any map, electronic or otherwise. The GPS insisted it was Route 19 L2 designation I'd never heard of. As a test, I pulled out my old paper atlas, the same one my father had given me when I started driving. The area where the GPS showed the alternate route was marked as nothing but contour lines indicating steep, undeveloped mountains, no roads, no towns, nothing but wilderness. But 42 mi was 42 miles, and 37 minutes could mean the difference between making my delivery on time and facing penalties for being late. Against my better judgment, I decided to investigate. The turnoff appeared exactly where the GPS said it would. A perfectly paved road branching off to the right with a green highway sign reading Route 19, Columbus 127 Midday. The pavement looked fresh, like it had been laid within the past year, but there were no construction signs, no orange cones, no indication of recent road work. What struck me immediately was the complete absence of traffic. If this road really saved 40 miles on a major trucking route, other drivers should have been using it. But as I made the turn and started down the new highway, I didn't see a single set of tail lights ahead of me or headlights in my mirrors. The road was beautifully engineered with gentle curves that followed the natural contours of the mountains and grades that never exceeded what a fully loaded truck could handle, comfortably. Whoever had built this highway understood trucking. The sight lines were perfect. The shoulders were wide enough for emergency stops, and there were even periodic pull-offs for slower vehicles. But something was wrong with the landscape. As I drove deeper into the mountains, I started passing things that didn't make sense. First, it was just old mining equipment, a rusted conveyor belt, some abandoned rail cars, the skeletal remains of a tipple where coal would have been loaded onto trucks. That wasn't unusual in West Virginia. The mountains are littered with remnants of the coal industry. What was unusual was the condition of some of the equipment. Mixed in with the obviously old rusted machinery were pieces that looked much newer. Bright yellow bulldozers, modern excavators, even some pieces with manufacturer tags that looked fresh. It was as if mining operations from different decades had been abandoned in the same location at different times. My CB radio started acting up around mile 15. Instead of the usual late-night trucker chatter, I was picking up fragments of conversations that sounded like they were coming from another era. Scratchy, distorted voices discussing coal prices and shift schedules using terminology I hadn't heard since my grandfather's stories about working the mines in the 1950s. Number 4, shaft is producing good. One voice crackled through the static. Tell Morrison his boys better be ready for the morning shift. Morrison, my family name, but my family had been truckers, not miners. And the voice sounded like it was coming from decades in or the past. That's when I noticed the mile markers were counting down instead of up. Most highways numbered their mile markers sequentially from a starting point, mile 1, mile 2, mile 3, and so on. But the markers on Route 19 Alt were counting backward. Mile 47, mile 46, mile 45. Like I was traveling towards some kind of endpoint rather than away from a beginning. By mile 30, the wrongness of the situation was becoming impossible to ignore. The road was taking me through terrain that should have been impassable mountains. But the landscape outside my windows didn't match any topography I knew in West Virginia. The ridgelines were wrong, the valleys too deep, the forests too dense and primitive-looking, and the radio chatter was getting clearer. Cave in at the Morrison site, a dispatcher's voice announced with urgent clarity. All units respond. We've got men trapped. How many? Another voice asked. 12 men on the night shift. Jake Morrison's crew. My hands tightened on the steering wheel. Jake Morrison, my name. But I'd never worked in a mine, never had a crew. The voices were talking about events that couldn't be real, about people who couldn't exist. That's when I saw the lights ahead. At first I thought it was another truck, but as I got closer I realized it was something much stranger. Spread across a valley. To my left were dozens of lights, the kind of industrial lighting you'd see at an active mining operation. Conveyor belts were moving, machinery was operating, and I could see the silhouettes of workers moving around the site. But according to every map I knew, there shouldn't be any active mining in this area. Most of the operations in this part of West Virginia had been shut down years ago when the coal played out. The road was beginning to curve downward now, descending into the valley where the mining operation was located. I could see that Route 19 alt ended at the mining site. There was no through traffic, no continuation toward Columbus. The road simply terminated at a large parking area filled with pickup trucks and work vehicles from different eras. Some of the vehicles looked current, late-model Ford F-150s and Chevy Silverados that could have been driven off dealer lots last week. Others were obviously older 1980s pickups with rust and faded paint. 1970s trucks with designs I remembered from my childhood, and scattered throughout were vehicles that looked like they belonged in a museum. 1950s work trucks and even older models I couldn't identify. It was like looking at 70 years of mining history parked in the same lot. As my truck rolled into the parking area because I couldn't figure out how to stop it, the brakes weren't responding properly. I saw the miners. They were coming off shift, walking from the mine entrance toward the parking lot with the slow, tired gait of men who'd spent 8 hours underground. Some wore modern safety gear, hard hats with LED lights, reflective vests, steel-toed boots that looked brand new. Others wore the older-style equipment I'd seen in historical photos. Carbide lamps, simple canvas clothing, leather boots worn smooth with age, and some of them looked like they'd stepped out of my family's old photographs. A tall, lean man with my father's face wearing 1960s-era mining gear walked directly toward my truck. Behind him came others, men with the Morrison family features, all dressed for different decades of mining work. My grandfather, who died when I was 12. My great-grandfather, who I'd only known from old pictures. And in the center of the group, wearing a hard hat with foreman stenciled on the front, was a man who looked exactly like me. He approached the driver's side of my cab and motioned for me to roll down the window. When I did, he spoke in a voice that was identical to my own. "You're late for your shift, Jake. The night crew's been waiting." "I'm not a miner," I said, though my voice sounded uncertain even to me. "I'm a trucker. I'm just trying to get to Columbus." He smiled, and it was like looking in a mirror. "Morrison men don't drive trucks, son. We work the mines. Always have, always will. Your crew's waiting in number 4 shaft." The other miners had surrounded my truck now, all looking up at me with patient, expectant faces. Some I recognized from family photos. Others were strangers who nonetheless looked unmistakably like family. They all wore the tools of their trade: pickaxes, shovels, lunch pails, safety equipment from across the decades. "Time to come home, Jake," my grandfather's voice called out. "Time to join the family business." That's when I realized what Route 19 Alt really was. It wasn't a shortcut to Columbus, it was a trap, a supernatural highway that had been collecting Morrison men for generations, pulling them away from their real lives and into an endless mining shift that spanned decades. I could feel myself being drawn into their rhythm, their expectations. Part of me wanted to climb down from the cab and join them, to take my place in the family tradition of working underground. But the rational part of my mind was screaming warnings. I fumbled for my emergency kit, the roadside safety equipment that every professional trucker carries. My hands found the emergency flares, the bright red highway flares designed to warn other drivers of disabled vehicles. I popped the cap on the first flare, and it burst into brilliant red light. The miners stepped back, shielding their eyes, and their solid appearance began to waver like heat mirages. "He's not ready," one of them called out. "Let him go. He'll be back." I lit 2 more flares and tossed them out the window. The harsh chemical light seemed to break whatever spell was holding my truck in the parking lot. The engine, which had been running but unresponsive, suddenly roared back to life under my control. I threw the truck into reverse and backed out of the parking area as fast as I dared. In my side mirrors, I could see the miners watching me go, their expressions sad, but not surprised. The 4 men who looked like me raised his hand in what might have been a farewell or a promise. As I retreated up the slope, the mining operation began to fade. The lights dimmed, the machinery fell silent, and the workers melted back into the darkness. By the time I reached the top of the ridge, there was nothing in the valley but empty forest. Route 19. Alt was gone, My truck was back on Interstate 77, the regular highway I should have been on all along. According to my GPS, I was exactly where I would have been if I'd never taken the detour. But according to my clock, I'd lost 4 hours somewhere in those mountains. I made it to Columbus 12 hours late with no explanation I could give my dispatcher that wouldn't result in drug testing and psychological evaluation. But here's the thing that still keeps me awake at night. Every GPS system I've checked since then shows Route 19 Alt as a real road. Truckers I talked to at stops mention taking the new shortcut through West Virginia that saves time on Columbus runs. Some of them never make it to their destinations. The road is still out there, still collecting Morrison men and probably others whose families have deep roots in the Appalachian mining industry. It's still promising shortcuts and time savings to drivers who don't know their family history. And sometimes late at night when I'm driving alone, I can hear them calling on the CB radio. "Jake Morrison, your shift starts in an hour. Time to come home to the family business. The mountains remember every family that's ever worked their depths, and they never let their workers truly retire." I've been maintaining trails in these mountains for 15 years, and I thought I knew every path, every hazard, every danger. But last October, I discovered that some trails maintain themselves, and they don't want human interference. My name is Tom Bradley, and after what happened on Section 12 of the Appalachian Trail in Virginia, I understand that humans are only guests in these ancient mountains, and some guests overstay their welcome. I've been a volunteer trail maintainer for the Appalachian Trail Conservancy since 2009. Covering a 20-mile section through the Blue Ridge Mountains in central Virginia. It's solitary work, but I love it. There's something deeply satisfying about keeping these pathways safe and accessible for the thousands of hikers who pass through each year. I know every rock, every route, every vista along my assigned section. I've replaced countless blazes, cleared fallen trees after storms, built water bars to prevent erosion, and repaired damaged bridges. Trail maintenance isn't glamorous work, but it's essential. Without regular upkeep, these paths would become overgrown and dangerous within a few seasons. Nature has a way of reclaiming what humans have carved out of the wilderness, and it's my job to maintain the delicate balance between preservation and access. This particular maintenance trip was scheduled after a severe October storm had swept through central Virginia. The Trail Conservancy had received reports of significant damage along several sections, fallen trees blocking the path, damaged blazes, and at least one bridge that had been washed out by flash flooding. I'd been assigned to assess and repair a 5-mile stretch that was reportedly hit hard. I drove up to the trailhead on a crisp Saturday morning. My pickup truck loaded with tools, paint for refreshing blazes, lumber for bridge repairs, and enough supplies for what I expected to be a long weekend of work. The damage reports had been extensive enough that I'd planned to camp at designated sites along the trail rather than drive back and forth each day. But when I reached the first reported damage site, I found something impossible. The trail was perfect, not just passable, but immaculate. The path was clear of debris, the blazes were fresh and bright, and the bridge that had supposedly been destroyed was not only intact but looked newly constructed. The wood was unstained, the bolts were shiny, and the entire structure appeared to have been built within the past week. I stood there for several minutes, checking my GPS coordinates and consulting my maintenance maps. This was definitely the right location. I'd been working this section for years and knew every landmark, but the trail showed no signs of recent storm damage. As I continued hiking to check the other reported damage sites, I found the same thing. Every fallen tree had been cleared, every washed-out section had been repaired, and fresh blazes marked the route with mathematical precision. Someone had beaten me to the maintenance work. But who? The Trail Conservancy maintains strict schedules and protocols. If another volunteer had been assigned to my section, I would have been notified. There are no professional maintenance crews working without coordination, and the work I was seeing was too extensive and skilled to be the result of well-meaning hikers cleaning up after themselves. That's when I noticed the tools. At the third repair site, I found a complete set of trail maintenance equipment arranged in a perfect line beside the path. Brush cutters, pruning shears, paintbrushes, measuring tools, all laid out with military precision. The tools were old but in pristine condition, and some were designs I'd never seen before. Vintage equipment that looked like it had been manufactured decades ago but showed no signs of wear or age. I called out, thinking another maintainer might be working in the area. "Hello? Is someone here? These your tools?" My voice echoed off the surrounding ridges, but there was no response. The forest was eerily quiet. No bird songs, no rustling of small animals, no sound of wind through the trees, just an oppressive silence that made me acutely aware of every sound I was making. I decided to continue my scheduled maintenance check, but I photographed the mysterious tools and their precise arrangement. Something about the scene felt deliberately staged, like a message I was supposed to understand. As I hiked deeper into my assigned section, I began noticing other anomalies. Blazes appeared in locations that weren't on my maintenance schedule. Perfect white rectangles painted on trees where no blazes should be. Some led off the official trail toward what appeared to be alternate routes I'd never seen before. Most disturbing were the footprints. In muddy sections of the trail, I found boot prints that appeared and disappeared, without pattern. A clear set of prints would suddenly end mid-stride, as if the person making them had simply vanished. Other prints began from nowhere, as if someone had materialized in the middle of the path. The prints were all the same size and tread pattern, suggesting a single person. But the spacing between steps was wrong. Sometimes too close together, sometimes impossibly far apart, as if the person making them didn't follow normal human locomotion patterns. By late afternoon, I was seriously considering abandoning the maintenance trip. Everything about the situation felt wrong, and my 15 years of wilderness experience were screaming warnings. But I'd driven 4 hours to get here, and I still had legitimate maintenance tasks to complete. I set up camp at a designated site about 10 mi into the section. As darkness fell, I tried to convince myself that there was a logical explanation for everything I'd observed. Maybe another volunteer had gotten confused about assignments. Maybe some of the damage reports had been exaggerated or mislocated. But around midnight, I heard them working. The sounds of trail maintenance echoed through the forest, the rhythmic thunk of someone chopping wood, the scrape of tools against stone, the whisper of brush being cleared. The sounds came from all directions, as if an entire crew was working throughout the forest. I grabbed my flashlight and headed toward the nearest sounds. But as soon as I left my campsite, everything went silent. I swept my light beam across the surrounding forest, but saw nothing except trees and shadows. When I returned to camp, I found my own tools had been moved. They were arranged in the same precise line I discovered earlier, laid out beside my tent, as if someone was making a point. The next morning, I woke to find that my section of trail had been transformed overnight. New blazes marked routes I'd never seen before. Elaborate wooden bridges spanned gullies that hadn't existed the previous day. Stone steps had been carved into steep sections with mathematical precision. The work was beautiful but impossible, the kind of construction that would take a professional crew weeks to complete. And all of it led hikers away from the established Appalachian Trail, toward unknown destinations in the deep forest. As I stood examining one of the new bridges, I heard a voice behind me. "You're not supposed to be here." I spun around and found myself facing something that might have once been human but clearly wasn't anymore. It was tall and thin, wearing clothes that looked like they'd been designed for trail work but were made from materials I didn't recognize. Its skin had a gray, weathered appearance like old bark, and its eyes were the deep green of forest shadows. "This is my section," I said, fighting to keep my voice steady. "I've been maintaining these trails for 15 years. It tilted its head, studying me with an expression that might have been curiosity. "These trails are older than your species. They were carved by creatures that knew the mountains before your ancestors dreamed of crossing the ocean. We maintain them for purposes you cannot understand. The Appalachian Trail is a public resource. I said people depend on proper maintenance for safety." The entity laughed, a sound like wind through dry leaves. "Your people walk where we allow them to walk. They see what we choose to show them. The trails you think you maintain are shadows of the real paths that run through these mountains." It gestured toward the bridges and blazes that had appeared overnight. "These led to places your maps don't show. Places where time moves differently. Where the mountains remember what they were before your civilization scarred them." "I just want to do my job," I said. "I want to keep the trail safe, then prove you understand what that really means." The challenge was simple but terrifying. I had to spend 3 days and nights following the entity's new blazes, maintaining the mysterious trails that led into unmapped wilderness, and demonstrate that I could work with respect for whatever intelligence governed these mountains. The trails I followed during those 3 days showed me parts of the Appalachian that don't exist on any topographical survey. I maintained bridges that spanned impossible canyons, cleared paths that led through forests where the trees were older than European settlement, and refreshed blazes that marked routes to places that felt like they existed outside normal reality. The entity watched me work, evaluating my technique, my respect for the environment, my understanding that I was a guest in something far larger and older than human civilization. On the third night, as I camped beside a stream that flowed uphill and reflected stars I didn't recognize, it spoke to me again. "You may continue your work, but understand that you work with our permission, not by right. The mountains will guide your efforts when they approve of your intentions." When I hiked back to my truck, the mysterious trails had vanished. My section of the Appalachian Trail looked exactly as it should, properly maintained but not impossibly perfect. My tools were back in my truck, arranged exactly as I'd packed them. I still maintain trails in these mountains, but now I ask permission first. I speak quietly to the forest before I begin work, explaining what I plan to do and why. Sometimes I find that maintenance tasks complete themselves overnight when the mountains approve of my efforts. Other times I discovered that repairs I've made have been subtly altered to serve purposes I don't fully understand. The mountains watch me work now, and I know I'm only there because they allow it. I've learned that trail maintenance isn't about imposing human will on the wilderness. It's about negotiating with intelligence far older and wiser than our species, and hoping that our small efforts to preserve these pathways align with whatever greater purpose guides the ancient trails through the heart of Appalachia. Some paths were carved by forces we don't understand, and the best we can do is maintain them with respect and humility. I was a fire lookout for 3 summers, watching over thousands of acres from a tower that was supposed to be abandoned. But I wasn't the only one up there. And what I saw through those binoculars still haunts my dreams. My name is Chris Morgan, and I need to tell this story because I've seen job postings for the same fire tower position, and I can't let another college student make the same mistake I did. I was 21 years old and desperately needed a summer job that would pay enough to cover my senior year tuition. Most of my friends were working retail or restaurant jobs, making barely above minimum wage, when I stumbled across a posting on the university job board that seemed too good to be true. The North Carolina Forest Service was hiring fire lookouts for remote towers throughout the Appalachian Mountains, offering twice the pay of typical summer jobs. The position was exactly what I needed, Isolated work that would let me study during quiet periods, good pay, and the kind of solitude that appealed to someone who'd spent 3 years dealing with crowded dorms and noisy roommates. I'd always been comfortable alone, confident in my ability to handle emergency situations, and the job description made it sound like paid camping with responsibilities. The interview was brief and oddly casual. The Forest Service supervisor, a weathered man named Henderson, seemed more interested in my psychological profile than my qualifications. He asked repeatedly if I was comfortable with isolation, if I had experience with radio equipment, and whether I'd ever experienced unusual phenomena in wilderness settings. Some of our towers are in very remote locations, he explained. Lookouts can go weeks without seeing another human being. The isolation affects some people more than others. We need someone who can handle the psychological pressure. He assigned me to T-Tower 47, located on a peak in the Pisgah National Forest that required a 4-hour hike to reach. The tower had been built in the 1940s but had been officially decommissioned in 1987 when aircraft surveillance became more effective than human observation. However, Henderson explained recent budget cuts had forced them to reactivate several remote towers as a cost-saving measure. The hike to Tower 47 was grueling but beautiful. The trail switch backed up increasingly steep terrain, passing through different ecosystems as I gained elevation. By the time I reached the tower, I was exhausted but excited. The structure was a classic fire lookout, a small cabin mounted on steel legs about 60 ft above the forest floor with windows on all sides offering panoramic views of the surrounding wilderness. But when I climbed the stairs to the cabin, I found something that made me uneasy. The previous lookout's belongings were still there. Personal items, clothes, even food in the small refrigerator. A coffee mug sat on the desk beside the radio, half full of liquid that had long since grown moldy. The logbook showed the last entry was from August 15, 1987. Day 73, strange lights in Sector 7 again. Reporting to dispatch. Weather clear, visibility excellent, something is definitely out there. Mere Patterson, that entry was dated just 3 days before the tower was supposedly decommissioned. I tried to raise my supervisor on the radio to ask about the previous lookout's belongings, but the response I got was strange. The voice that answered wasn't Henderson's. It was a woman with an accent I couldn't place, and she seemed confused about which tower I was calling from. Tower 47. That's been closed for decades, honey. You sure you're reading your coordinates, right? When I insisted that I was indeed in Tower 47 and had been officially assigned there, she put me on hold. After several minutes, Henderson's voice came through the static. Just ignore the previous lookout stuff. Patterson was eccentric. Focus on your job and report any fire activity you observe. The first week passed without incident. I established a routine. Morning weather observations, hourly sweeps of the forest with binoculars, radio check-ins with dispatch, and evening reports. During quiet periods, I studied for my upcoming senior year and enjoyed the incredible solitude of being alone above the forest canopy. But the binoculars showed me things that didn't make sense. In sectors where there were no roads, no trails, no human access, I would observe movement that looked like people walking through the forest. They moved in straight lines, ignoring the natural contours of the terrain, and they traveled at speeds that seemed impossible for humans on foot. When I tried to track them with the binoculars, they would simply vanish as if they'd never been there. The radio conversations were even more disturbing. During routine check-ins with dispatch, I would sometimes hear other voices breaking in. Previous lookouts reporting from towers that had been demolished years ago. They spoke in calm, professional tones, describing weather conditions and fire activity as if they were still on duty. Tower 23 to dispatch. Visibility 8 Mr. Wind from the southwest at 15 knots. Unusual fire activity in Sector 12, but it's not spreading normally. Flames are moving uphill against the wind. Tower 8 reporting. Day 127 of continuous duty, still no relief scheduled. The watchers in the forest are getting closer to the tower base. Request immediate backup. When I asked Henderson about these transmissions, he claimed I was picking up old recordings. Some kind of radio echo phenomenon common in mountainous terrain, but the conversations were too immediate, too interactive to be recordings. On my 10th day in the tower, I discovered a hidden room. Behind a bookshelf in the main cabin was a narrow door I'd somehow missed during my initial exploration. The room beyond was filled with decades of surveillance equipment. Cameras with massive telephoto lenses, recording devices, and hundreds of photographs documenting things that shouldn't exist. The photos showed the same figures I'd been observing through binoculars, but in much greater detail. Tall, thin beings that moved through the forest with unnatural grace. Some appeared to be watching the tower itself, standing motionless at the forest edge for hours at a time. One photograph made my blood run cold. It showed the interior of Tower 47 taken from outside the cabin windows. In the image, I could see myself sleeping in the small cot, but standing beside me was one of the tall figures leaning over my bed as if studying me. The photograph was dated 2 nights earlier. That's when I understood that Tower 47 had never been decommissioned. It had been converted into an observation post for monitoring supernatural activity in the region. The Forest Service wasn't watching for fires, they were watching for something else entirely. The radio crackled to life as I studied the photographs, but this time the voice wasn't dispatch or another lookout. It was something else, something that had been listening to all my transmissions. "Good evening, Lookout Morgan. We've been watching you watch us. It's time we had a conversation." I spun around to find one of the tall figures standing in the doorway of the hidden room. Up close, it was obviously not human. Its proportions were wrong. Too tall, too thin, with joints that bent in directions that defied anatomy. Its face was a smooth expanse of gray skin with eyes that reflected light like an animal's. "You're doing the same job as your predecessors," it said, its voice somehow coming from inside my head rather than through my ears. "Watching the forest, recording observations, reporting anomalies. The only difference is that you don't yet understand what you're really observing." "I'm just a college student," I said, backing toward the main cabin. "I'm just here for the summer." Patterson thought he was just doing a job too. Ann Richardson before him and Thompson before him. They all learned the truth. Eventually, the tower exists to monitor the boundary between your world and ours. Someone has to watch the watchers. It gestured toward the surveillance equipment. "Your species sees only 3 dimensions, but we exist in several. The tower's position allows observation of dimensional incursions that threaten both our realms. The previous lookouts understood their real purpose. They chose to stay." "Stay? What happened to them?" "They're still here, still watching, still reporting. The job never ends." "Look out, Morgan. The mountains need permanent observers who understand what they're really seeing." I could hear voices through the radio now. Dozens of them, all checking in from towers that existed in dimensions I couldn't perceive. Past lookouts reporting on fires that burned in space between worlds, on creatures that moved through forests of probability, on weather patterns that existed in the spaces between thoughts. "You can join them," the entity continued. "Or you can leave and spend the rest of your life knowing that the boundary is unguarded, that incursions will go unnoticed, that your world will slowly bleed into ours until the distinction no longer matters." I thought about my normal life, my senior year of college, my plans for the future. But I also thought about the responsibility I'd unknowingly accepted when I took this job. If the tower really was monitoring threats to both dimensions, abandoning it could have consequences I couldn't imagine. That's when I remembered my emergency procedures training. Every lookout carries a satellite beacon for life-threatening situations. I activated mine, sending a distress signal to Forest Service headquarters, but the response I got was impossible. The rescue team claimed they couldn't locate Tower 47. According to their records, no such tower existed in the Pisa National Forest. The coordinates I provided showed only empty wilderness. The entity watched me with what might have been amusement. The tower exists between dimensions. Look out, Morgan. Your rescue team operates in only one. They cannot reach you unless you choose to return to their reality. For 3 days, I maintained my position, continuing to file reports and watch the forest while trying to figure out how to escape the interdimensional trap I'd walked into. The entity didn't threaten me, but it made clear that leaving would require abandoning my post and potentially exposing both worlds to dangers I couldn't comprehend. On the 4th day, during a brief thunderstorm, something changed. The lightning seemed to ground the tower back into normal reality. And for a few minutes I could see the forest as it actually was. Without the dimensional overlays, without the watchers, without the impossible geography. I grabbed my pack and ran for the stairs, rappelling down the tower's exterior as fast as I dared. Behind me, I could hear the entity calling my name along with the voices of all the previous lookouts who had chosen to stay. I made it to the trail just as the storm cleared and the tower began to fade back into its interdimensional state. I ran down the mountain without looking back, not stopping until I reached my car at the trailhead. When I tried to report what had happened, I found that Tower 47 had been removed from all official records. The Forest Service had no record of my employment, no documentation of the position, no knowledge of any reactivated fire towers in the region. I never took another fire lookout job, but sometimes I still hear the radio calls past lookouts checking in, reporting fires that burn in dimensions we can't see, watching for incursions that threaten the boundary between worlds. The mountains are always watching and someone has to watch back. But I chose to live in only one dimension, even if that meant leaving the job unfinished. Some responsibilities are too heavy for a college student to carry, and some towers are meant to remain abandoned. If you see a posting for fire lookout work that pays too well and requires too little experience, think twice before applying. The mountains need watchers, but they prefer the kind who never ask to come home. I'm sharing this story because I need people to understand that some places underground should never be explored, no matter how experienced you think you are. 6 months ago, I descended into a cave system in eastern Kentucky that doesn't appear on any geological survey, and I'm still not sure I ever really made it back to the surface. My name is Rebecca Martinez, and I used to be a professional spelunker. Used to be because after what I found in the depths beneath the Daniel Boone National Forest, I can't look at cave entrances without hearing voices calling from the darkness below. I've been exploring caves for 12 years, ever since I discovered the sport in graduate school while studying geology. There's something deeply satisfying about navigating underground passages, about being the first person to see formations that have been growing in darkness for millions of years. I've explored cave systems throughout the Southeast, from the massive chambers of Mammoth Cave to the technical challenges of the deepest pits in Alabama. I'm certified in cave rescue. I carry proper equipment and I never cave alone. Those are the rules that keep splunkers alive. But this time I broke my own rules. I was in Kentucky conducting research for my doctoral dissertation on Carr's geology when I heard about the cave system from a local named Jimmy Caldwell. I'd been interviewing longtime residents about historical cave usage, how earlier generations had used caves for storage, shelter, and sometimes less legal activities during Prohibition. Jimmy was in his 80s, sharp as a tack, and he knew more about the region's underground geography than anyone I'd met. There's a cave system up on Bent Creek Ridge that ain't on any of your maps, he told me over coffee at a diner in Hazard. My daddy showed it to me when I was a boy, but I ain't been back since. Something about that place just ain't right. He described a cave entrance hidden behind a waterfall accessible only during dry seasons when the water level dropped. The entrance led to a massive chamber system that extended for miles underground with passages connecting to other cave networks throughout the region. But Jimmy's description was vague, almost deliberately so, as if he was reluctant to provide too much detail. "Why isn't it mapped?" I asked. "A system that large should be well documented." Jimmy's expression darkened. "Some things are better left alone, miss. My daddy told me the cave was old when his grandfather was a boy. Said it was a place where things went to die and sometimes they don't stay dead." I should have heeded his warning, but I was too excited by the possibility of discovering an unmapped cave system. Finding Virgin Passage is the holy grail of spelunking, and the academic implications for my research were enormous. I convinced Jimmy to give me directions to the entrance, though he refused to guide me there personally. The hike to Bent Creek Ridge took most of a morning, following game trails and creek beds through terrain that showed no signs of human passage. The waterfall Jimmy had described was exactly where he'd said it would be. A 40-foot cascade dropping into a deep pool surrounded by limestone cliffs, but the water level was high and the cave entrance was completely submerged. I waited 2 weeks for a dry spell to lower the water level, camping in the area and documenting the surface geology while I waited. When the waterfall finally reduced to a trickle, I could see the cave entrance, a dark opening behind the falls about 6 ft high and 4 ft wide. Against every safety protocol I'd ever learned, I decided to make an initial solo reconnaissance. I told myself I was just going to check the entrance, maybe explore the first chamber to determine if it was worth bringing a full team. I had full technical gear, multiple light sources, and emergency communications equipment. What could go wrong? The entrance passage was a low crawl for about 50 ft before opening into a chamber that took my breath away. My headlamp beam disappeared into darkness above and to both sides, indicating a space larger than most mapped caves in the region. The walls were covered in flowstone formations that sparkled like crystal in my light, and the floor was smooth limestone carved by ancient water flow. But what struck me immediately was the silence. Cave systems usually echo with the sound of dripping water, the flutter of bat wings, the subtle creaks and groans of shifting rock. This cave was completely quiet, as if the earth itself was holding its breath. I set up my gear and began documenting the chamber, taking photographs and measurements. The space was roughly circular, about 200 ft in diameter, with passage openings leading off in multiple directions. Some were large enough to walk through comfortably. Others were tight squeezes that would require crawling. That's when I noticed the bones scattered across the chamber floor were skeletal remains. Not just animal bones, but human skulls and femurs mixed with the remains of deer, bear, and other forest creatures. The bones were ancient, bleached white by time and mineral deposits, but they were arranged in patterns that suggested deliberate placement rather than natural accumulation. I was photographing one particularly large arrangement when I heard the first voice. Rebecca, my name spoken clearly from somewhere deeper in the cave system. The voice was female, familiar though I couldn't place it. I called out in response, but my voice echoed strangely in the vast chamber, seeming to multiply and distort before fading into silence. Rebecca, come deeper. We've been waiting. This time I recognized the voice. It was my sister Maria, who had died in a car accident 3 years earlier. But that was impossible. Maria had never been a caver, had never even visited Kentucky. I tried to convince myself it was acoustic phenomena. Perhaps wind moving through the passages, creating sounds that resembled human speech. But as I continued exploring, the voices became more frequent and more distinct. My graduate advisor, Dr. Peterson, called my name from a passage to my left. My childhood friend Sarah whispered encouragement from somewhere above. Even my grandmother, who had died when I was 12, urged me to continue exploring to find what was waiting in the deepest chambers. All of them were people I'd lost, people I'd grieve for, people whose voices I would recognize anywhere. I should have turned back. Every instinct developed over 12 years of caving was screaming warnings. But the voices were so warm, so welcoming, and they were guiding me toward discoveries that would revolutionize cave science. I followed the largest passage deeper into the system, navigating by the sound of the voices. The passage sloped steadily downward, and my depth gauge showed I was descending far below the water table. The formations around me became increasingly elaborate. Flowstone cascades, enormous stalactites, and crystal formations I'd never seen before. After what felt like hours of walking, I entered a chamber that defied geological explanation. The space was vast, easily the size of a football stadium with a ceiling lost in darkness above. But the impossible part was the light source. A soft phosphorescent glow emanating from the walls themselves, bright enough to see by without my headlamp. The chamber was filled with people, dozens of them, all sitting in meditation poses on the smooth limestone floor. They wore clothing from different eras, some in modern hiking gear, others in outfits that looked decades old. Some were in clothing so ancient it looked like costumes from a historical museum. They all turned to look at me as I entered, and I saw faces I recognized mixed with strangers. Maria was there, looking exactly as she had before the accident. Dr. Peterson sat beside her, wearing the same field clothes he died in during a cave-in 2 years earlier. My grandmother smiled at me from across the chamber, unchanged by the decades since her death. "Welcome home, Rebecca," Maria said, standing and walking toward me. "You've been searching for us for so long." "This isn't real," I whispered, backing toward the passage entrance. "You're dead. You're all dead. Death is just another passage," my grandmother said gently. "Like the caves you love to explore, we found the deepest chamber, the final room where all passages converge." Dr. Peterson stood and approached me, his expression kind but alien. "The cave system is older than human civilization. Rebecca, it's been collecting explorers for millennia. Everyone who truly loves the underground eventually finds their way here." I looked around the chamber and realized that some of the seated figures weren't human at all. They were older, more primitive, with bone structures that suggested they'd been here since before modern humans evolved. Ancient cave explorers from species that had vanished from the surface world. "You can stay," Maria said, taking my hand. "No more loneliness, no more searching, just the eternal exploration of passages that exist between life and death." The warmth of her touch was real, more real than anything I'd experienced since her death. The temptation to stay, to join the eternal gathering of explorers, was overwhelming. But my equipment was still working, still recording data, still maintaining a connection to the surface world. My emergency beacon was transmitting GPS coordinates to cave rescue teams who would come looking for me if I didn't return on schedule. I activated my emergency locator and ran for the passage entrance. Behind me, the voices rose in chorus, not angry but sad, disappointed that I was choosing the loneliness of the surface over the community of the depths. The passage that had brought me to the chamber was gone. In its place were dozens of openings, all leading in different directions, all promising to take me deeper into the earth. The cave system was shifting, reconfiguring itself to keep me from leaving. I followed my rappelling rope, the lifeline I'd installed on my way down. But the rope led me to passages I'd never seen before, through chambers that defied the geology of the region. Time moved strangely in the darkness. My watch showed I'd been underground for 3 hours, but it felt like days. Finally exhausted and disoriented, I saw a natural light ahead. I crawled toward it desperately, expecting to find the entrance behind the waterfall. Instead, I emerged from a cave opening I'd never seen before, miles from where I'd entered in a valley I didn't recognize. My GPS unit showed impossible coordinates. According to the device, I was in a location that should have been solid rock hundreds of feet underground. But I was definitely on the surface, standing in afternoon sunlight beside a creek I'd never seen on any topographical map. I hiked for 2 days before finding a road that led to civilization. When I tried to report the cave system to geological authorities, I discovered that the area I described didn't exist on any survey. The waterfall on Bent Creek Ridge was listed as a minor seasonal flow with no associated cave systems. I never found Jimmy Caldwell again. The diner where we'd met had no record of employing anyone by that name, and none of the locals I interviewed remembered him. I stopped caving after that experience, sold all my gear, abandoned my dissertation, and took a job teaching high school geology in a landlocked state with no significant cave systems. But I still hear them calling. On quiet nights, I can hear Maria's voice echoing from storm drains and subway tunnels, from basement and underground parking garages. She's still waiting in that phosphorescent chamber, along with Dr. Peterson and my grandmother and all the other explorers who chose to stay. The underground world is vast and connected in ways we don't understand. Every cave system is just an entrance to the deeper network. The eternal passages where those who truly love the darkness eventually find their home. I chose the surface, but part of me is still down there, still exploring, still being guided by voices that promise the ultimate discovery. Lies just ahead in the next chamber, around the next bend in the passage. The earth remembers everyone who has ever descended into its depths, and some invitations to explore are harder to refuse than others. I'm telling this story because families deserve to know the truth about what happened to their loved ones in these mountains. For 8 years, I was part of the Appalachian Search and Rescue Team, and I thought I'd seen every way the wilderness could claim someone. But last September, I discovered that some people don't go missing, they get taken. My name is Lisa Hartwell, and after what I found during the search for the Morrison family, I understand that not every rescue mission is meant to succeed. I became a certified search and rescue volunteer after my brother got lost in the Blue Ridge Mountains during a college hiking trip. He was found after 36 hours, dehydrated and hypothermic, but alive. The SAR team that saved him inspired me to train in wilderness rescue, and I've spent nearly a decade responding to calls throughout western North Carolina and eastern Tennessee. Search and rescue work is methodical scientific. We use probability maps based on terrain and weather conditions, deploy trained search dogs, coordinate with helicopter crews, and follow established protocols that have saved thousands of lives. We know that lost hikers typically follow water sources downhill, that injured people seek shelter, and that most people are found within the first 72 hours if they're going to be found alive. But the Morrison case broke all the rules. The call came in on a Tuesday morning in late September. David and Karen Morrison, both experienced hikers in their 50s, had failed to return from a planned 3-day backpacking trip in the Pisgah National Forest. Their daughter had reported them missing after they didn't check in at their scheduled time Monday evening. The Morrisons were model hikers. They'd filed a detailed itinerary with the ranger station, carried proper gear, and had been hiking the Appalachian Mountains for over 20 years. Their planned route was a well-established loop trail that they'd completed multiple times before. These weren't inexperienced tourists who'd wandered off marked paths. Our team assembled at the trailhead Wednesday morning. 12 volunteers, 2 search dogs, and a helicopter on standby. The weather had been perfect during their planned hiking window. Clear skies, mild temperatures, no precipitation. Conditions were ideal for a successful search. We started by following their intended route, looking for any signs of deviation from the planned itinerary. For the first 8 miles, everything appeared normal. We found evidence of their passage, a granola bar wrapper in their characteristic spot, boot prints matching their gear in muddy sections of trail, even a photo they'd taken at a scenic overlook based on the timestamp on a camera they dropped. But at mile marker 12, their trail simply vanished. The boot prints we'd been following just stopped in the middle of the trail. Not gradually, not because they'd moved onto rocky terrain where tracks would be harder to spot, but abruptly, as if David and Karen Morrison had simply ceased to exist in mid-stride. "This doesn't make sense," said Tom Bradley, our team leader with 15 years of SAR experience. "People don't just disappear. There has to be an explanation." We expanded our search pattern, assuming they'd left the main trail for some reason. But our search dogs, highly trained German shepherds with hundreds of successful rescues to their credit, couldn't pick up any scent trail beyond the point where the tracks disappeared. That's when I noticed the cameras. Scattered throughout the forest, mounted on trees at roughly 8 ft intervals, were small digital cameras with telephoto lenses. They were positioned to provide overlapping coverage of the entire area, creating a comprehensive surveillance network. The cameras were weatherproof and appeared to be solar-powered, suggesting a permanent installation. "Tom," I called out, "are you seeing these cameras? This area is under surveillance." But when Tom and the other team members came to look, they saw nothing. According to them, I was pointing at empty trees. The cameras were invisible to everyone but me. I tried to convince myself it was stress-induced hallucination, a result of too many difficult searches and too little sleep. But the cameras were too detailed, too consistent to be products of my imagination. I could read serial numbers on the equipment and see LED indicators showing they were actively recording. On the second day of the search, we found the first Morrison campsite. It was exactly where their itinerary indicated it should be set up according to their usual patterns. But something was fundamentally wrong with the scene. The tent was pitched perfectly, guidelines taut and properly staked. Their gear was organized with military precision. Cooking equipment cleaned and stored, clothes folded and packed away, hiking boots placed side by side at the tent entrance. It looked like a camping equipment advertisement rather than a site where real people had spent the night. But there were no signs of human occupation, no scuff marks in the dirt, no bent grass where people had walked, no food crumbs or coffee stains. It was as if the campsite had been assembled by someone who knew how the Morrisons camped, but had never actually seen humans use outdoor equipment. "This is staged," I told Tom, photographing the eerily perfect campsite. "Someone set this up to look like the Morrisons were here, but they never actually used this equipment." Tom examined the site carefully but disagreed. "Everything looks normal to me, Lisa. Maybe they're just very neat campers." The search dogs refused to enter the campsite. Both animals, normally eager to work and responsive to commands, sat at the perimeter, whimpering and backing away from the tent. When their handlers tried to force them closer, the dogs became agitated and tried to retreat toward the main trail. That night, as our team made camp about a mile from the Morrison site, I heard the voices for the first time. "Lisa, help us." Karen Morrison's voice, clear and desperate, coming from the direction of their abandoned campsite. "We're trapped. Something's keeping us here." I woke Tom and the other team members, but they heard nothing. The forest was completely silent except for the normal sounds of wind through trees and distant owl calls. But I could hear the Morrisons clearly pleading for rescue, describing a location that didn't match any terrain feature on our topographical maps. "They're in a place between the mapped area and somewhere else," Karen's voice explained. "The cameras are watching us. The watchers won't let us leave." On the third day, following the sound of their voices rather than established search protocols, I found myself hiking alone toward an area that appeared on no official maps. The terrain was wrong. Too steep, too densely forested with rock formations that didn't match the regional geology. The cameras were everywhere now, not just mounted on trees but emerging from the ground, growing from rock faces, integrated into the landscape itself. They tracked my movement with mechanical precision, lenses adjusting focus to maintain clear images as I passed. That's when I found the real Morrison campsite, hidden in a valley that shouldn't exist, surrounded by mountains that rose impossibly high above the forest canopy. Was a campsite that looked exactly like what I'd expect from two experienced hikers. Gear scattered naturally, a fire ring with cold ashes. Hiking boots kicked off casually beside a tent that showed signs of actual use. But David and Karen Morrison weren't there. In their place were two figures that looked like sophisticated mannequins positioned in hiking poses, but obviously artificial. They wore the Morrisons' clothes and carried their identification, but their faces were blank and featureless. When I approached, they turned to look at me with empty eye sockets that held tiny camera lenses. "The search is over," one of them said in Karen Morrison's voice. "We've been found safe and sound. Please tell our family we're continuing our hike and we'll be in touch soon." That's when I understood what had happened. The Morrisons hadn't gotten lost. They'd been collected. Something was using the wilderness as a testing ground, observing human behavior through an extensive camera network and occasionally taking subjects for closer study. The mannequins were placeholders designed to provide closure for search and rescue operations, while the real Morrisons were held somewhere the cameras couldn't show me. The staged campsite our team had found was part of the deception meant to satisfy SAR protocols and end the search without revealing the truth. "Where are they?" I demanded. "Where are the real Morrisons?" The mannequins tilted their heads with mechanical precision. "They are being studied. Their hiking patterns, their gear choices, their decision-making processes under stress. The data is valuable for understanding human wilderness behavior. Let them go. The study is not complete, but you may join them if you wish. Your search and rescue experience would provide useful baseline data for comparison." I ran. I crashed through the impossible forest, ignoring the camera lenses that tracked my movement from every tree and rock behind me. I could hear the mannequins pursuing within human speed, their movements too fluid for artificial joints. I followed my GPS back toward the main trail, but the device showed impossible coordinates. According to the satellite data, I was simultaneously at the original search area and 30 minutes away in terrain that didn't exist on any map. When I finally reached our base camp, I found Tom and the other S members packing equipment. According to them, the search had been successful. The Morrisons had been found safe and had chosen to continue their hiking trip rather than return immediately. "But I saw mannequins," I insisted. "The people you found weren't human." Tom looked at me with concern. "Lisa, you've been under a lot of stress. Maybe you should take some time off from SR work." I tried to show them the photographs I'd taken of the cameras, the impossible valley, the artificial Morrisons. But my camera showed only normal forest scenes, trees, rocks, and empty trails. The evidence of the surveillance network had been erased or had never existed in the first place. The official report stated that David and Karen Morrison had been located unharmed and had declined rescue assistance, choosing to complete their planned hiking itinerary. Case closed. Successful operation. But I know the truth. The Morrisons are still out there somewhere between the mapped world and the places the cameras watch. They're being studied by intelligence that understands human behavior well enough to create perfect mannequins, but doesn't understand why we would sacrifice sleep and safety to search for missing strangers. I resigned from the S team after that operation. I couldn't continue pretending that every missing person case had a normal explanation when I knew that some people are taken for purposes we can't comprehend. But I still monitor the missing persons reports from the Appalachian region, names of experienced hikers who disappear without trace, leaving behind staged campsites and impossible evidence. Families who accept explanations that don't make sense because they need closure more than they need truth. The cameras are still watching. The surveillance network spans thousands of square miles through the most remote sections of the mountains. And sometimes when experienced hikers fail to return from well-planned trips, I know they haven't gotten lost. They've been selected for study by something that views human wilderness behavior as data to be collected. The Appalachian Mountains are a laboratory, and we're the subjects being observed. Most of us are allowed to return to our normal lives, but some are kept for more detailed examination. Search and rescue teams do their best to find the missing, but we can't rescue people who've been taken beyond the boundaries of the world our maps can show. We can only document the carefully staged evidence left behind and tell families that their loved ones chose to continue hiking rather than accept help. The mountains watch everything that moves through their wilderness, and some watchers don't distinguish between observation and collection. We assume we're exploring wild places, but sometimes the wild places are exploring us. The cameras remember every hiker who's ever walked these trails, and the surveillance network never stops recording. Most of the data is probably harmless, just observation of human behavior in natural settings, but sometimes the observers decide they need closer study, and experienced hikers like the Morrisons provide the perfect subjects. I chose to stop searching because I couldn't handle finding people who are no longer entirely human, replaced by artificial versions designed to end investigations and provide closure. But the cameras are still watching, still recording, still selecting subjects for study. The next time someone you know goes missing in the Appalachian wilderness, remember that not every search ends with rescue. Sometimes the missing stay missing because they're serving a different purpose in places our maps don't show, watched by cameras that exist between the world we know and the one that studies us from the shadows. What I'm about to tell you will sound impossible, but I need people to understand that there are species in these mountains that shouldn't exist, and something is collecting them. 3 months ago, I was tracking what I thought was an endangered black bear population in the Great Smoky Mountains. Instead, I discovered that the Appalachians are home to a wildlife preserve unlike anything in our scientific understanding. My name is Dr. Sarah Chen, and I used to be a wildlife biologist. Used to be because after what I found in those remote valleys, I can't look at animal tracks without wondering which ones belong to creatures that exist between our world and somewhere else. I've spent 8 years studying Appalachian wildlife populations, focusing on endangered and threatened species throughout the region. My specialty is large mammal tracking: bears, elk, mountain lions, and the occasional wolf sighting that officially doesn't exist in these mountains. I use a combination of traditional tracking methods, trail cameras, and GPS collar technology to monitor animal populations and their habitat usage patterns. The project that changed everything was a Grant F-funded study of black bear populations in the most remote sections of the Great Smoky Mountains. Recent sightings suggested a previously unknown bear subspecies might be living in areas so isolated that they developed unique characteristics. If confirmed, it would be a significant conservation discovery and could lead to expanded protection for critical habitat areas. The research zone was a 15,000-acre section of wilderness accessible only by helicopter or a 2-day hike through terrain that most visitors never see. I'd been dropped off with 2 months of supplies and a scheduled pickup date, along with enough trail cameras and GPS equipment to monitor animal movement throughout the area. The first week was exactly what I'd expected from remote wildlife research. I documented normal Appalachian fauna, deer, wild boar, raccoons, and a healthy black bear population that showed no obvious subspecies characteristics. My trail cameras captured typical nighttime activity patterns, and the GPS data showed normal territorial behavior for large mammals. But during the second week, I started finding tracks that didn't match any species in my field guides. The first anomalous tracks appeared near a stream about 5 mi from my base camp. They looked like bear prints, but were significantly larger than any black bear I documented, with claw marks that extended much further than normal. The stride length suggested an animal that stood at least 8 ft tall, larger than most grizzly bears, which weren't supposed to exist in the southeastern United States. I cast the prints in plaster and photographed them from multiple angles, but when I tried to identify the species using wildlife databases, nothing matched. The closest comparison was to prehistoric cave bear tracks I'd seen in paleontology textbooks, but those animals had been extinct for 20,000 years. Over the following days, I found more impossible tracks. Cat prints the size of dinner plates that belong to no known North American feline species. Wolf tracks from animals that must have weighed over 200 lb. Bird tracks from something with a wingspan that would require a creature larger than any known raptor. My trail cameras were capturing even stranger footage. The motion-activated cameras showed animals that moved through the forest with intelligence that went beyond normal wildlife behavior. Bears that walked exclusively on their hind legs, maintaining perfect posture like humans. Deer that traveled in formation with military precision, changing direction simultaneously as if responding to unheard commands. Birds that flew in geometrically perfect patterns, creating aerial displays that looked deliberately choreographed. But the most disturbing footage showed animals that seemed to be watching the cameras themselves. A massive black bear would approach a camera, study it carefully, then position itself to avoid the motion sensor while remaining visible in the frame, as if it understood the technology and was deliberately being photographed. I tried to radio my research coordinator to report the findings, but my satellite phone couldn't establish connection despite showing full signal strength. The GPS coordinates on my equipment showed impossible readings. According to the devices, I was simultaneously in the Great Smoky Mountains and in locations that didn't exist on any topographical survey. That's when I discovered the collection facility. Following a game trail toward higher elevation, I crested a ridge and found myself looking down into a valley that shouldn't have existed. The terrain was wrong for the region, too flat, too circular, surrounded by peaks that rose impossibly high above the forest canopy. And in the center of the valley was a structure that looked like a combination of wildlife preserve and research laboratory. Enclosures stretched across the valley floor, each one containing animals I'd never seen before. Some looked like evolutionary throwbacks to prehistoric species. Others appeared to be hybrid creatures that combined characteristics of multiple animals in ways that defied biological possibility. And in the largest enclosures were the missing people. I recognized some of them from missing person reports I'd seen. Hikers, hunters, and researchers who had disappeared in the Appalachian wilderness over the past several years. They moved with the same choreographed precision I'd observed in the trail camera footage, following invisible commands and maintaining perfect formation as they walked predetermined paths around their enclosures. They still looked human, but their eyes held the same vacant intelligence I'd seen in the animals. They were aware, but their awareness had been redirected toward purposes I couldn't understand. Standing at the edge of the facility were figures in clothing that looked like park ranger uniforms. But their movements were too fluid, their proportions slightly wrong. They watched the enclosures with scientific interest, occasionally making notes on devices that resembled clipboards, but seemed to be made from materials that didn't exist in nature. That's when one of them noticed me. The figure turned toward my observation point with mechanical precision, and I found myself looking at something that wore a human face like a mask. Its features were perfect, but expressionless, and its eyes reflected light, like an animal's. When it raised its hand in what might have been a greeting, I could see that its fingers had too many joints. "Dr. Chen," it called out, and its voice carried perfectly across the impossible distance. "Thank you for accepting our invitation. Your research has been very helpful in identifying suitable specimens." I realized that my entire study had been orchestrated. The grant funding, the remote location, the 2-month isolation period, everything had been designed to bring me to this place at the right time. My trail cameras hadn't been documenting wildlife behavior. They had been documenting my behavior for something that was studying human researchers. The same way we studied animals. Your expertise in animal tracking makes you an ideal candidate for our collection. The figure continued. "We've been observing your methodology. You understand animal behavior well enough to appreciate the beauty of our preserve." I could see other researchers in the human enclosures now. Field biologists, park rangers, and wildlife photographers who had been integrated into the fossils collection. They moved with the same purposeful behavior as the impossible animals, following invisible instructions and maintaining patterns that served purposes beyond human understanding. The figure began walking up the ridge toward my position, moving faster than should have been possible on the steep terrain. Behind it, other uniformed figures emerged from hidden positions throughout the facility. They'd been watching me the entire time, allowing me to observe their operation before making their approach. I ran. I crashed through the forest, abandoning all my research equipment and heading toward what I hoped was the direction of my base camp. Behind me, I could hear them following, not running, but maintaining that same steady pace that suggested they knew I couldn't escape. My GPS equipment showed contradictory readings as I ran, coordinates that placed me in multiple locations simultaneously. The forest itself seemed to be shifting, with trails appearing and disappearing to guide me away from potential escape routes. But I remembered the fundamental rule of wildlife tracking. Animals follow water sources. I ignored my GPS and followed the sound of running water, hoping to find the stream that led back to known territory. Hours later, exhausted and disoriented, I stumbled onto a hiking trail marked with official Park Service blazes. The trail led to a ranger station where a very human park ranger expressed concern about a lone hiker emerging from restricted wilderness areas without proper permits. When I tried to report the facility and the collection of missing persons, I discovered that my research grant had never existed. The university had no record of funding my project, and the helicopter drop-off I remembered was documented nowhere in Park Service flight logs. The trail cameras and GPS equipment I'd abandoned in the forest were never found. Despite extensive searches by Park Service personnel, according to official records, I'd never been authorized to conduct research in the area where I claimed to have been working. But the tracking skills that made me valuable to that collection facility also helped me avoid recapture. I've learned to recognize the signs of their surveillance, animal behavior that's too coordinated, track patterns that suggest impossible species, and wildlife photography opportunities that seem too convenient. The collection facility is still operating, still gathering specimens for purposes that exist beyond human scientific understanding. I work as a high school biology teacher now in a landlocked state with no significant wilderness areas, but sometimes I receive job offers for wildlife research positions in remote locations, always funded by organizations that don't quite exist and requiring skills that match my exact expertise. The Appalachian Mountains are home to a preserve that collects rare species, and human researchers are among the rarest specimens of all. Something is studying our study methods, observing our observation techniques, and occasionally deciding that our expertise would be more valuable as part of their collection than as independent researchers. I chose not to become an exhibit in their facility, but I know they're still watching. Every wildlife documentary I see, every nature photograph I encounter, every animal track I notice, I'm always evaluating whether it represents natural behavior or coordinated performance by specimens that exist to demonstrate the beauty of scientific collection. The mountains remember every researcher who's ever studied their wildlife, and some studies are designed to recruit the researchers themselves. We think we're documenting animal behavior, but sometimes the animals are documenting us for intelligence that appreciates scientific methodology enough to want it permanently preserved. If you're offered an opportunity to study rare species in remote locations, especially if the funding source is vague and the isolation period is extended, remember that some wildlife preserves aren't meant to release their specimens back into the wild. Some collections are designed to be permanent, and some researchers become the most valuable exhibits of all. The mountains are full of creatures that shouldn't exist. Guided by intelligence that understands conservation better than we do, they preserve everything they find valuable, and dedicated researchers are among the rarest species in their collection. We thought we were getting the deal of a lifetime, a luxury cabin in the Smokies for half the normal price. But some places are cheap because no one who stays there ever leaves to complain about the accommodations. My name is Emily, and what happened during that anniversary weekend nearly destroyed our relationship and my sense of reality. I need to share this story because I've seen the same rental listing pop up again, and I can't let other couples fall into the same trap. My husband Jake and I had been looking forward to our 5th anniversary for months. After years of tight budgets and demanding jobs, we finally had enough saved for a romantic getaway. We wanted something special, a place where we could reconnect away from the distractions of everyday life. When we found the listing for a luxury cabin in the Great Smoky Mountains, it seemed too good to be true. The photos showed a stunning log cabin perched on a mountainside with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking misty valleys, a stone fireplace, and a hot tub on the wraparound deck. The description promised modern amenities, complete privacy, and hiking trails right outside the door. But the price was shockingly low, less than half what similar properties were charging. The website was oddly sparse. No company name, no phone number, just an email address and a simple booking form. There were no reviews, which we assumed meant it was newly listed. The property was described as Whispering Pines Retreat, and the photos looked professional. So we didn't think twice about booking it immediately. The confirmation email was brief. Thank you for choosing Whispering Pines. Enjoy your stay. The cabin will be ready for your arrival. No check-in instructions, no contact information, nothing about keys or access codes. When Jake tried to reply asking for details, the email bounced back as undeliverable. We drove down from Ohio on a Friday afternoon in early October, following GPS coordinates provided in the booking confirmation. The route took us deeper and deeper into the mountains, past tourist towns, and onto increasingly narrow roads. For the last 20 miles, we saw no other traffic, no houses, no signs of civilization. "Are you sure we're going the right way?" Jake asked as our car climbed a steep gravel road that barely seemed wide enough for one vehicle. I checked the GPS again. This is definitely it. Maybe they wanted to emphasize the complete privacy part of the listing. The sun was setting when we finally reached what appeared to be our destination. A clearing in the forest with a log cabin that looked exactly like the photos. It was beautiful in the golden light, with smoke curling from the chimney and warm light glowing in the windows. Someone had clearly prepared for our arrival. But as we parked and got out of the car, something felt wrong. The silence was too complete. No birds singing, no insects buzzing, no wind rustling through the trees. It was as if the entire forest was holding its breath. The front door was unlocked with a note on the kitchen counter. "Welcome to Whispering Pines. Everything you need has been provided. Enjoy your stay." The handwriting was elegant but old-fashioned. written with what looked like a fountain pen. The cabin was immaculate and exactly as advertised. The furniture was expensive-looking rustic pieces. The stone fireplace dominated one wall and the views from the deck were breathtaking. But there was something sterile about it, like a museum display rather than a place where people actually lived and relaxed. We unpacked and tried to settle in, but small things kept bothering us. The refrigerator was fully stocked with food we hadn't requested. Fresh bread, local honey, wine that looked decades old. The closets contained clothes in our exact sizes, vintage pieces that looked like they'd been waiting for us. And despite the booking confirmation promising Wi-Fi and cell service, our phones showed no signal whatsoever. "This is weird, right?" I asked Jake as we sat on the deck with glasses of the mysterious wine. "I mean, how did they know what food to get? How did they know our sizes?" Jake shrugged. "Maybe they have a standard welcome package. Rich people probably do this kind of thing all the time." That first night, I had trouble sleeping. The silence outside was oppressive, and I kept feeling like someone was watching us through the large windows. Around 3 in the morning, I got up to close the curtains and saw something that made my blood freeze. There were lights moving through the forest. Not flashlights or headlamps, but soft, flickering glows like candles carried by invisible hands. They drifted between the trees in slow, purposeful patterns, always staying just at the edge of visibility. "Jake," I whispered, shaking him awake, "look outside." But by the time he joined me at the window, the lights were gone. The next morning, we found a leather-bound guest book on the coffee table that hadn't been there the night before. It was filled with entries from couples who had stayed at the cabin dating back to the 1970s. The early entries were enthusiastic, praising the beauty of the location and the luxurious accommodations. But as we read through the years, the tone of the entries changed. Guests began mentioning strange dreams, feeling watched, and having difficulty leaving when their stay was over. Some entries ended abruptly mid-sentence. Others were written in increasingly erratic handwriting, as if the writers were losing their grip on reality. The most recent entry was dated just 2 weeks before our arrival. It was written in a shaky hand. Day 12. "We were supposed to leave yesterday, but the car won't start. Jake says we should hike out, but the trails keep leading us back here. The cabin doesn't want us to go. If someone finds this, don't stay past your checkout time. Don't let it keep you." My hands were shaking as I showed the entry to Jake. "We need to leave," I said, "right now." But Jake was strangely calm. "It's probably just people trying to scare future guests. You know how these mountain communities can be. They like their legends and ghost stories." I noticed he was speaking differently, his voice flat and distant. When I looked in his eyes, they seemed unfocused, like he wasn't quite present. We tried to go for a hike to clear our heads, but the trails around the cabin behaved impossibly. Paths that should have led down the mountain curved back toward the cabin. Trail markers pointed in directions that made no geographical sense. After 3 hours of hiking, we found ourselves back on the cabin's deck, exhausted and confused. That afternoon, while exploring the cabin's basement, I discovered something that confirmed my worst fears. Behind a stack of old furniture was a wall covered in photographs. Dozens of couples, all roughly our age, all posing happily in front of the cabin. The photos spanned decades, judging by the clothing and hairstyles. But here's what made me scream. In the most recent photo, taken in modern color, were Jake and I. We were smiling and holding hands on the cabin's deck, wearing clothes I didn't recognize. At the bottom of the photo, someone had written in that same elegant handwriting, "The Richardsons, October 2024. They decided to stay forever." I ran upstairs to find Jake, but he was sitting motionless in front of the fireplace, staring into the flames with that same vacant expression. "Jake, we have to go now. Something is very wrong with this place." He turned to look at me, and for a moment his eyes cleared. Emily, what's happening to me? I feel like I'm disappearing. That's when I understood the cabin wasn't just trapping people physically. It was slowly erasing their personalities, their desire to leave, their connection to the outside world. It fed on couples' happiness and love, keeping them as permanent guests until they forgot they'd ever had lives anywhere else. I grabbed our car keys and pulled Jake toward the door, but he resisted, his vacant look returning. Why would we leave? We just got here. We paid for 3 nights. The car wouldn't start. The engine turned over but wouldn't catch, as if something was preventing it from running. I tried Jake's phone, my phone, even an old landline I found in the cabin's kitchen. Nothing worked. As night fell, I could hear voices outside, dozens of them all speaking in the same flat, emotionless tone I'd been hearing from Jake. They were calling our names, inviting us to join them for dinner, for games, for a permanent vacation that would never end. I found Jake standing at the front door, his hand on the knob, ready to go outside. "They're our friends," he said drily. "They've been waiting for us. They want to show us around the property." I had to make a desperate choice. I remembered the guest book entry about not staying past checkout time. Our reservation was through Sunday morning. Maybe that was the key. I grabbed the guest book and tore out every page with our names or photos. I threw them into the fireplace and watched them burn. As the flames consumed the evidence of our stay, Jake suddenly snapped back to awareness. "Emily, what's happening? Where are we?" The voices outside grew angry, no longer friendly and welcoming. The cabin began to shake as if something massive was pounding on it from all sides. Windows cracked and the lights flickered wildly. But the car started. We threw our things into the back seat and drove down that gravel road faster than was safe, not stopping until we reached the main highway. In the rearview mirror, I could see the cabin's lights fading, and for a moment it looked like the entire structure was dissolving into mist. When we got home and tried to find the rental website again, it was gone. Our credit card showed no charge for the reservation. It was as if Whispering Pines' retreat had never existed. But sometimes on quiet nights when Jake and I are at home together, we both get the same feeling. A gentle tugging at the back of our minds, a voice whispering that our real home is waiting for us in the mountains. We've moved twice since then, but the feeling follows us. The mountains remember their guests, and some invitations are harder to decline than others. If you ever find a rental that seems too good to be true, trust your instincts. Some places are cheap because the previous guests never lived to leave bad reviews.